Would you pretend to be my husband? For one night?
I was halfway through locking the front doors of the Cedar Ridge Community Library when a woman I had never seen before slipped inside, breathing hard as if she'd run the last mile without stopping. She looked over her shoulder before looking at me, not like someone afraid of being late, but like someone terrified of being found. Then she asked the kind of question that permanently divides your life into before and after. "Would you pretend to be my husband for one night?" she whispered. I stared at her, still holding the ring of library keys in my hand. "Only if you tell me who you're hiding from," I answered. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, eyes filling with tears she was clearly determined not to let fall. "I can't," she said. "Not yet." 5 years earlier, a judge had signed the final page of my divorce while my ex-wife sat across the courtroom refusing to meet my eyes. We had spent nearly a decade trying to build a family that never came. After countless doctor visits, failed treatments, and quiet disappointments, she finally admitted she couldn't keep living inside the grief. She didn't leave because she hated me. She left because every empty bedroom in our house reminded her of the children we'd never have. I didn't blame her then, and I don't blame her now. But after that day I stopped expecting life to surprise me. I became the man who unlocked the library every morning at 8, shelved returned books with military precision, recommended mystery novels to retirees, and knew every child's favorite reading corner by heart. My father used to tell me that libraries weren't buildings full of books, they were shelters where lonely people borrowed hope until they could make some of their own. I never really understood what he meant. I thought I was just protecting paper and shelves. Looking back now, I realize I was waiting for someone to walk through those doors without knowing it. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 36 years old, and I have spent the last 4 years believing my story had already reached its quiet ending. Then, on an ordinary Thursday evening in a town where everyone recognized everyone else's truck before they recognized the driver, a frightened woman I'd never met asked me to become her husband for a single night. What I didn't know was that she would eventually give me 3 different reasons for asking. Each one sounded believable. Each one was more painful than the last. And the truest reason wouldn't come from her at all. It would come months later from a little girl sitting cross-legged in the children's reading corner, clutching a worn copy of Charlotte's Web, who would unknowingly say one sentence that would change everything I believed about family, love, and the people who choose us when we least expect it. Before I could decide whether I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life or the best decision I'd ever make, I looked back at the frightened stranger standing beneath the library lights, took a slow breath, and repeated the only question that mattered. "Tell me who you're hiding from." She looked at the wedding band I still wore out of habit more than hope, then quietly replied, "If I tell you now, you'll probably say no." In that moment, I had absolutely no idea that saying yes would become the reason I finally stopped mourning the life I thought I'd lost forever. She finally introduced herself as Amelia Carter, though even then she hesitated before saying her last name, as if speaking it aloud carried a weight she wasn't ready to share. She looked to be about 33, dressed in a navy blazer that had probably looked professional that morning but now bore faint wrinkles from what had clearly been the longest day of her life. She apologized 3 different times in the span of a minute for barging into the library after closing, then glanced toward the windows again. "Is someone outside?" I asked. She shook her head too quickly. "Not anymore." That answer wasn't convincing, but something about the exhaustion in her face kept me from pressing further. Instead, I unlocked my office and offered her a chair. She wrapped both hands around the paper cup of coffee I made for her without taking a single sip. Finally she whispered, "Tomorrow evening my grandmother is celebrating her 82nd birthday." I nodded, waiting. "She has advanced Alzheimer's. Some days she remembers me. Some days she doesn't. But tomorrow, she thinks she's meeting my husband for the first time." I frowned. "Your husband?" Amelia lowered her eyes. "He doesn't exist." The silence between us stretched until she filled it herself. "My grandmother raised me after my parents died. She's forgotten almost everything now, but she still asks every week whether I've found someone who loves me. 6 months ago I got tired of breaking her heart, so I told her I'd gotten married. She laughed once, bitterly. A harmless little lie, I thought. Then she had one of her clearer weeks and insisted on meeting him at her birthday dinner. I leaned back in my chair. So you need someone to play the part? She nodded. Just one evening. Just long enough to let her have one happy memory. It sounded almost believable, almost simple. Yet something in her expression told me that wasn't the whole story. People don't spend an hour looking over their shoulder because of an old woman's birthday party. And that's everything? I asked quietly. She hesitated just long enough for me to notice. It's enough, she answered. That wasn't a yes. It was an escape. My father had another saying besides the one about libraries. He believed that when people lied, they usually hid the smallest lie behind a larger truth. There really was a grandmother. There really was a birthday. But there was something else standing in the shadows of Amelia's story. I could feel it. Still, I looked at the woman sitting across from me, exhausted, frightened, and clearly carrying more than she could manage alone. For years of living by myself had taught me something unexpected. Loneliness recognizes itself in other people long before words do. What exactly would I have to do? I asked. Relief flooded across her face so suddenly it almost hurt to watch. Just have dinner. Hold my hand if Grandma reaches for it. Smile in a few family pictures. Leave afterward. You'll never have to see me again. She reached into her purse and slid an envelope across my desk. I didn't open it. What's this? $2,000. I pushed it back immediately. If I do this, it won't be because you're paying me. She stared at me for several seconds before quietly asking, then, why would you? I didn't have an answer that made much sense. Maybe because my father spent his whole life teaching me that sometimes people don't need fixing, they just need someone willing to stand beside them when nobody else will. Or maybe because after years of believing my life had become nothing more than quiet routines and empty evenings, a frightened stranger had walked into my library asking me to become part of her impossible story. I should have walked away. Instead, I heard myself say the one word that would change both of our lives forever. Okay. Saturday evening arrived colder than expected, and by the time I pulled into the long gravel driveway of the Carter family farmhouse, I had already rehearsed Amelia's story so many times that it almost felt true. We had spent 2 hours that afternoon in the library conference room going over imaginary details that somehow sounded more believable because they were so ordinary. We had supposedly met at a charity book sale 18 months earlier. I preferred black coffee. She couldn't cook anything without burning it. I always forgot anniversaries, and she pretended to be annoyed about it. Tiny imperfections, she explained, made fake relationships look real. As we walked toward the front porch together, she slipped her hand into mine. It wasn't romantic. It was survival. Even so, I felt her fingers trembling. Still time to leave, I whispered. She forced a smile without looking at me. If you leave now, my grandmother will spend the rest of the night asking why her granddaughter wasn't good enough to be loved. Before I could answer, the front door swung open. An elderly woman with silver hair and bright blue eyes beamed at us from her wheelchair. There you are, she exclaimed. I told everyone my handsome grandson-in-law wouldn't keep an old woman waiting. Amelia knelt beside her, kissed her forehead, and for the first time since we'd met, I saw every ounce of fear disappear from her face. Happy birthday, Grandma. The old woman reached for my hand next. Take good care of my girl, she said softly. She's been alone for far too long. Those words hit harder than they should have because they weren't entirely wrong. Throughout dinner, I answered questions about a marriage that had never happened, laughed at family stories I'd never heard before, and watched Amelia slowly relax as her grandmother smiled more than anyone else in the room. For a while I almost believed this strange arrangement had been exactly what she claimed it was, a harmless act of kindness for an old woman whose memories were slipping away. Then I noticed the man standing near the dining room doorway. He wasn't eating. He wasn't talking. He was simply watching us. Mid-40s, expensive suit, expression carved from stone. Every time Amelia looked in his direction, her shoulders stiffened. Finally he walked over, extended a hand toward me, and smiled without warmth. "Richard Lawson," he said. "Amelia's former fiancé." The word former landed heavily between us. Amelia's fingers tightened around the edge of the tablecloth. "Richard, this isn't the time." He ignored her completely. "Funny," he continued, looking directly at me. "I didn't know she'd gotten married." "Life surprises people," I answered calmly. He chuckled. "Sometimes." Then he leaned closer, close enough that only the three of us could hear him. "Especially when the husband doesn't exist until a few days before the party." Every muscle in my body went still. Amelia had gone completely pale. Richard straightened his jacket as if he'd merely commented on the weather. "Enjoy dinner," he said pleasantly before walking away. I turned toward Amelia, waiting for an explanation, but she couldn't even meet my eyes. The birthday celebration continued around us, children laughing in the backyard, candles glowing on the cake, relatives taking photographs, but suddenly none of it felt real anymore. The grandmother's happiness was real. The warmth in that house was real. Everything else had become a performance hiding something much larger than I had agreed to. When dessert was served, Amelia quietly whispered, "Please, not here. I'll explain everything after we leave." It was the second time she'd promised an explanation. And somehow I already knew the truth. Waiting outside that farmhouse would be nothing like the story she'd told me in the library. The drive back into town was almost completely silent. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, and Amelia kept both hands folded tightly in her lap, staring through the passenger side window as though the darkness outside might somehow answer the question she knew I was about to ask. I didn't speak until I parked outside the library. The street was empty, the old clock tower across the square striking 10 as I turned off the engine. "Richard knew," I said quietly. "He knew this wasn't just about your grandmother." Amelia closed her eyes for several long seconds before whispering, "I know." She stepped out of the truck without another word, walked beneath the awning of the library entrance, and leaned against one of the brick columns. When I joined her, she looked smaller than she had the night we first met, as if carrying the truth had finally become too heavy. "The story about Grandma wasn't a lie," she said. "It just wasn't the whole story." I waited. Richard and I were engaged for almost 3 years. Everyone thought he was perfect. Successful attorney. Respected family. Charming in public. Her voice cracked. Behind closed doors, he controlled everything. She wasn't dramatic when she said it. That somehow made it worse. Who I talked to. Where I went. What I wore. He read my messages, tracked my phone, even decided which friends I was allowed to keep. She looked down at the engagement ring-shaped mark that had long since faded from her finger. Every time I tried to leave, he'd apologize just enough to make me doubt myself. My stomach tightened. I'd seen stories like that in newspapers. They always sounded distant until someone standing 3 feet away quietly admitted they'd lived through one. "So what changed?" I asked. "Grandma." A faint smile crossed her face. She had one of her clear days and looked at me across her kitchen table. She asked why I smiled with my mouth but never with my eyes anymore. Amelia laughed bitterly. "She has Alzheimer's, Ethan. She forgets what she ate an hour ago." But somehow she remembered what fear looked like. She finally ended the engagement 6 months earlier. Richard hadn't hit her. He hadn't threatened her outright. Instead, he'd done something almost impossible to prove. He simply refused to disappear. Flowers at her office. Messages from unfamiliar numbers. Chance encounters at grocery stores that felt far too planned. Friends mentioning they'd spoken to him even after she asked them not to. He always stays just inside the line, she whispered. Never enough for the police. Never enough for a restraining order. Just enough to remind me he can still reach me whenever he wants. I suddenly understood why she'd kept looking over her shoulder in the library. She wasn't hiding from one moment. She'd been hiding every day for months. So why ask me? I finally said. Amelia looked directly at me for the first time since we'd left the farmhouse. Because Richard believes no man would ever choose me after him. Tears filled her eyes despite her obvious effort to stop them. When Grandma insisted on meeting my husband, I realized something. If I showed up alone, Richard would see exactly what he wanted to see, that I was still trapped in the life he left me with. I didn't just need someone to comfort Grandma. I needed someone standing beside me so Richard would finally understand that he wasn't the center of my world anymore. She swallowed hard. That was the second reason. I stood there absorbing everything she'd said, but one detail refused to leave my mind. Earlier tonight, I said slowly, Richard told me I didn't exist until a few days ago. Amelia's expression changed instantly. The color drained from her face all over again. Before she could answer, headlights swept across the empty street. A black SUV rolled slowly past the library, paused for just a second in front of us, then continued down the road. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. We both knew exactly who had been behind the wheel. Neither of us moved until the black SUV disappeared around the corner, its taillights swallowed by the darkness beyond the town square. Amelia wrapped her arms around herself, but it wasn't the cool night air that made her shiver. It was the realization that Richard had followed us all the way from her grandmother's house without bothering to hide it. He wants me to know he's still watching, she whispered. I unlocked the library and switched on the lights, not because either of us needed a book, but because brightly lit places somehow feel safer than empty streets. We sat in the children's reading corner, surrounded by tiny chairs and colorful picture books, and for several minutes neither of us said a word. Finally, Amelia reached into her purse and pulled out a folded envelope that looked as though it had been opened and closed 100 times. There's something else I haven't told you, she said quietly. The biggest reason I asked you. She handed me the envelope. Inside was a faded crayon drawing. It showed a woman holding hands with a little girl beneath a bright yellow sun. Beside them stood a tall man with messy brown hair, all three smiling. Across the top, written in uneven block letters, were the words, "My family." I looked up, confused. Who's the little girl? Amelia's eyes filled instantly. Her name is Lily. My heartbeat slowed. Your daughter? She nodded. She's 6. Every piece of the story rearranged itself in my mind. You told me you lived alone. I lied. She lowered her head. Not because I wanted to. Because after everything with Richard, I stopped trusting strangers with the most important person in my life. I stared at the drawing again. Richard isn't her father? Amelia shook her head. No. Lily's father died in a construction accident 3 months before she was born. Richard came into our lives 2 years later. At first he was wonderful with her. She even called him her hero. Her voice cracked under the weight of the memory. Until she started getting older. I didn't interrupt. Children notice things adults think they're hiding. She saw how quiet I became. She heard us arguing behind closed doors. One afternoon she asked me if I smiled differently before Richard moved in. Amelia wiped away a tear. That's when I knew I couldn't stay. She looked toward the empty doorway leading to the children's section. She's been staying with my aunt this weekend because I didn't want her anywhere near tonight. I thought I could handle this by myself. She laughed softly, though there wasn't any humor in it. Turns out I couldn't. I looked at the drawing once more, then back at the woman sitting across from me. The strange request in the library, the fake marriage, the terrified glances over her shoulder, the dinner, Richard's appearance, it had all been leading here. But somehow I still felt there was one final piece missing. Before I could ask another question, the front bell above the library door jingled. We both turned instinctively. A little girl with curly brown hair rushed inside wearing oversized pajamas beneath a raincoat, clutching a stuffed rabbit against her chest. Behind her stood an older woman, breathless from hurrying. "Mom!" the little girl cried, running straight into Amelia's arms. Amelia held her so tightly it looked like she was afraid to let go. Then the child noticed me standing a few feet away. She studied me with the blunt honesty only children possess before smiling politely. "Hi," she said. "Are you Ethan?" I nodded. She smiled even wider. "Mom said you helped us tonight." Then she looked down at the crayon picture still lying open on the table. Very matter-of-factly, she asked the question that would change everything. "Do you think, maybe next time I draw my family, I can draw you too?"